Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for jumping on today and being here for our webinar. We are very excited about having this webinar today. We have our very own Courtney Sand, who is one of our neuro resource facilitators here and has been with us for a little over a year. So our title of our webinar today is Caregiving After Brain Injury, the Stages of Grief and Loss. My name is Annie Randolph, and I'm a neuro-resource facilitator here as well with the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa, also our Outreach and Resource Network manager as well. We will be recording this webinar, and we will have it archived on our YouTube page in the coming days, so look out for that. We will save time at the end of the session for any questions you have, so please feel free to go ahead and type in your questions into the chat box as you think of them, and then we will respond to them in the order they appear at the end of the session. But no CEUs will be provided, but we will provide a certificate of attendance through your email after the session. So if you need that, or if you have any questions about that, feel free to let me know. Now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker, Courtney Sand. She is a licensed and board certified behavior analyst and certified brain injury specialist trainer. She is currently employed with us here as a neuro resource facilitator, and she has nearly 20 years of experience in the field of applied behavior analysis and mental health in California and Iowa, across a variety of settings and populations, including autism programs, a domestic violence shelter, school districts, a community-based neurobehavioral rehabilitation service provider, and an outpatient mental health clinic where she helped start an autism spectrum disorder program. Courtney has been working in the field of brain injury for the last 5 years, and she is very passionate about playing a part in the process of behavior change. She is enthusiastic about helping spread awareness and education about brain injury and supporting survivors of brain injury, their loved ones, and community stakeholders in accessing beneficial services to promote self-advocacy and progress toward their goals. So, Courtney, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, and you should be able to start whenever you're ready.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, perfect. Good morning, everybody. I'm really excited about this topic, and I'm truly am honored and humbled to be presenting on it to so many of you. Thank you for your interest in this topic and for your time this morning. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, both professionally as well as personally. I'll kind of share some of my own personal story throughout. If you haven't heard of the term ambiguous loss before today, it's very likely that you've experienced it on some level. So with that, let's dive right in. So the objectives for today, the things that I'm hoping that you come away with are that you become familiar with what ambiguous loss is and why it's unique to brain injury, becoming familiar with the stages of grief, and becoming familiar with the 6 guidelines of ambiguous loss and how to live with ambiguous loss and how to apply these strategies. My hope is that if you're a professional today, you will walk away from this presentation with knowledge that will help you support your clients in navigating life after brain injury and ambiguous loss. And if you're a survivor or a caregiver, that you feel, if you're just hearing this term for the first time, that you feel validated and heard, that this is a unique experience, but it's not unique to you, and there is a name for it. So we're going to talk a little bit about our society and how it responds to grief. First of all, it's an incomplete list. Our society accepts the need to grieve and publicly mourn physical death of a loved one. But there is very little understanding, as many of you know, the need to process and grieve someone who is still alive but changed. So when living with ambiguous loss, in this case following a brain injury, you often hear things like, at least he is still alive. You should be grateful. At least he can still talk. Or you should count your blessings. She can still walk. But when you quote at least all over people, you make them feel minimized, defeated, and alone, silenced and shut down, unheard, compared, and invalidated. Because to you, whether you're the survivor or the caregiver, in this case, the caregiver, that person is here, but not here. So when you hear things like, you should be grateful, at least he can still talk, you're thinking, well, When my husband gets mad now, my once gentle and kind husband is verbally abusive towards me, and he's not patient anymore. Things are different. You should count your blessings, at least she can still walk. Well, if my wife tries to walk by herself, she falls. She's fallen 3 times. And if she wants to walk, I have to put a gait belt on her and help her by myself. So to you, things are very different. I don't feel lucky. This is not luck. And I don't feel blessed. I don't feel like I have any blessings to count. Some disabilities look like this, and others look like the bottom picture. Because brain injury is often hidden and looks like the quote normal picture below, the effects are often not seen. This makes things that much more confusing, like nothing happened on the outside. I have clients that I work with, spouses that are the caregivers of their spouse, and they hear things like, aren't you back to work yet? She looks great. And they're thinking on the inside, no, she needs 24 care. She needs help with everything. These are the things that other people don't see. When those around us don't acknowledge or recognize our grief, it makes us feel like we don't have permission to grieve this kind of loss, and you feel incredibly lonely. Oftentimes, and I hear this from the clients that I work with, people will often self-isolate just to avoid comments and questions from people who don't understand what it is that they're going through. Our society assigns a timeline to grief, an unfair and unrealistic timeline, when in fact there is no timeline and there's no endpoint. Grief is not something that you get to. It's something that you will continually and always move through. It's not predictable. It's not linear. You don't move expectedly. We'll talk about stages of grief, but you don't move from one to the other expectedly. It's messy. And grief that lasts longer than weeks or months may look to the people around you like you're being self-indulgent, you're attention-seeking, you're throwing a pity party. Stop being so dramatic. Our society operates by a set of unspoken shoulds for how we ought to feel and behave in the face of sorrow. And to make the process of ambiguous loss that much more difficult, there's something called asynchronous grief that can occur in a family where you're grieving at different stages. This makes it hard to grieve together, and it can compound the grieving process. This is a picture of what healing can feel like. The messiness of mourning is a term that I've heard. The grief is the soul acknowledging what we value. So it's not messy. And it doesn't often match what people think it should look like. I've shared this in some of my previous presentations because I think it's really powerful. I'm going to share it with you all today. I found it on, I think, Facebook actually, and I've listed it in my bibliography if you're curious and want to look it up on your own. So it's an analogy about grief, and it's called the ball in the box. So grief is like this. There's a box with a ball in it and a pain button. In the beginning, the ball is huge. You can't move the box without the ball hitting the pain button. It rattles around on its own in there, hitting the button over and over. Almost any action triggers it. You can't control it, it just keeps hurting. Sometimes it seems unrelenting. As time goes on, the ball will usually very gradually shrink, and the pain button is activated less often. The ball hits the button less and less, but when it does, it hurts just as much. It's better though, because you can function day to day more normally, but the downside is the ball randomly hits that pain button when you least expect it. For most people, the ball never really goes away. It might hit less and less, and you have more time to recover between hits, unlike when the ball was still huge. It's not unusual for certain pain triggers to cause the ball of grief to grow larger for a period of time after you thought it had permanently shrunk. So ambiguous loss, and this, like I said, might be the first time you may have felt this for a long time, not knowing that there was an actual term for it. So ambiguous loss is the loss of a person, is the loss a person experiences when there is a lack of resolution or clarity, no verification of death, or no certainty that the person will come back or return to the way they used to be. Pauline Boss is kind of known as the guru of ambiguous loss, and she coined this term in the 70s when she was working with families of soldiers who weren't missing. This is often called a relational condition, ambiguous loss, because it ruptures relationships. It's been called a coming undone from previous attachments and an unraveling. There are two types of ambiguous loss. The first type is a physical absence with a psychological presence. So the person is not physically with you, but they're psychologically and emotionally still very much a part of your life. So those kinds of examples would be someone who's missing, abduction, kidnapping, being separated or divorced, adoption, military deployments, immigration, slavery, genocide, natural disasters, miscarriage, early childhood death, and incarceration. I also found another example that I thought was kind of interesting for singleness. So for adults who are single, when they feel like there's a missing person, their desired spouse or significant other, very much present in their mind, they've imagined this person in their life together, yet they're physically absent from their daily life. They've not met yet. The second type of ambiguous loss is the type we're going to be talking about today. So it's type 2, where there's a physical presence, someone is still here, but they're emotionally, psychologically, and or cognitively absent or changed. So examples for type 2 would be addiction, Alzheimer's, ALS, Parkinson's, dementia, brain injury, coma, chronic mental illness, autism, gender transitioning, workaholism. So examples where somebody is, like I said, still with you, but not. They're here, but they're changed. And there's often the feeling of an emotional death before a physical one. My grandpa, for example, lived with ALS for about a decade and had 2 strokes. So it felt like I lost him twice. Once he started to cognitively change, we began the process of grieving. And then once he passed, we felt like we lost him again. So with ambiguous loss, you can feel like you lose somebody over and over. It's incredibly painful. There's no body to bury. There's no death certificate, no certainty. It makes coping very challenging. Complicated loss means complicated grief. Ambiguous loss is referred to as the most stressful kind of grief that there is. Ambiguous loss is referred to as having but not having. Other terms that you might hear are extraordinary grief, frozen sadness, complicated grief, mobile mourning, chronic sorrow, incremental death, the feeling of you losing somebody over and over, an unending loss, the longest loss and the longest goodbye. Ambiguous loss is grief that reaches into the past to what was and how things were, as well as into the future to what could have been. And in my job every day as a neuroresource facilitator with the Brain Injury Alliance, I hear stories like these from a parent of a child who sustains a brain injury. They're grieving their future dreams, the participation in sports and school activities, the child's education, the job they would have had, their spouse, their grandchildren. For spouses, the dream house, the trip you plan to take, hobbies you looked forward to, retirement, growing old together, grandparenting together. Ambiguous loss makes it devastatingly hard for you to find hope or move on and inhabit this, quote, new normal. And just recently I talked to somebody who said there's no such thing as normal after a brain injury. There's nothing normal about it. You are literally relearning the world in the aftermath of this kind of loss. Some of the effects of ambiguous loss are things like it immobilizes individuals and thus their relationships. You end up feeling very frozen in place. It confuses decision-making processes. It freezes the grief process, feeling very stuck and paralyzed. It blocks coping processes and it prevents closure, leaving you to feel helpless and hopeless and exhausted. Ambiguity is the culprit in this kind of loss. And it's important to remember for people that experience this, that your reaction to ambiguous loss is not crazy. The situation is. Ambiguous loss can make you feel that way. And some of the individual effects of ongoing ambiguous loss that we often see here at the Brain Injury Alliance are things like anxiety and depression, substance abuse, violence, and suicide as a means of coping. As I said earlier, ambiguous loss is all about relationships. We are, to a large extent, defined by the relationships we have with other people. We're a certain way with them, they're a certain way with us, and we're a certain way together. Ambiguous loss is a relational condition. So thus it requires relational interventions, which I'll talk about in a little while. You grieve who they were as well as who you were in relationship to them. In instances of catastrophic memory loss, am I still his wife? Am I still a wife if he doesn't even know who I am anymore? Author Megan O'Rourke, in her book, The Long Goodbye, says when you lose someone you were close to, you have to reassess your picture of the world and your place in it. The more your identity is wrapped up with the deceased, the more difficult the mental work. Relational interventions have a focus on family and community-based interventions versus individual therapy. And it's not to say that individual therapy is not effective, but we'll talk a little bit later about the concept of community care with ambiguous loss. With brain injury, there's something called the primary impact. So things like mobility, communication, vision, hearing, level of fatigue, those are all compromised and can be in some way. These kinds of impacts of brain injury are usually very visible, overt to the people around you. And the effect of these impacts on someone's life are generally pretty obvious to someone else. If you're in a wheelchair and you need someone to open the door for you, those kinds of things, they're more obvious. These impacts generally garner more sympathy and compassion than secondary impacts. Secondary impacts of brain injury. In dealing with ambiguous loss, there is something called the loss of relationship mutuality. And this is a less obvious, more hidden impact that many people deal with. It's in a spousal relationship, the feeling of the loss of a partnership. The balance has suddenly shifted and it can feel very one-sided. You're no longer able to participate in previous familiar roles and duties. A two-income family now becomes a one-income family. For a stay-at-home parent that now maybe has to go get a job for the first time. You were functioning as a co-parenting team and now your spouse has a brain injury and you're kind of feeling like the only parent. You once were lovers. That can be affected. You were each other's best friends and confidants. That changes. Often leaving people feeling resentment and bitterness, jealousy, anger, sadness, and just the general feeling that it's not fair. We didn't ask for this, we didn't deserve this, it's not fair. And for a caregiver, these are more subtle and harder for others to see. A secondary impact, another one, is self-identity. Just the feeling of losing yourself. I don't recognize who I am, I miss who I used to be, and I have no idea who I am now. Am I still his wife, his lover, if I'm his full-time caretaker? What does that mean? Another impact is uncertainty. People often ask themselves if their loved one will return to their former self, or if they do, how much will they return to their former self? And there's no guarantees or timeframes as much as we want there to be. And you can often fluctuate between hope and hopelessness. And to add to the confusion, sometimes your loved one can, quote, reappear. You may feel frozen with this kind of uncertainty, and then you can hold out for the truth, or you end up learning to live with and develop a new narrative. This sort of uncertainty can make you very hypervigilant and anxious. For about a month before my grandpa passed, I spent my mornings and my evenings before and after work visiting him at the skilled nursing facility where he was. And I had my first panic attack sitting on the bed in his nursing facility. And because with dementia, in his instance, people can kind of come in and out like he did. Sometimes he was here in a, quote, normal way. I would be able to say, oh, my Grandpa Jake, I get to see him today. We get to talk. He knows who I am. And then in a flash, he would be gone. And cognitively, psychologically, not there anymore. So eventually, I consciously decided that I would love and support and keep the company of whoever was there when I arrived, whether it was the Grandpa Jake that I knew and he was lucid, or my Grandpa Jake and he was hallucinating and disoriented. Another impact, secondary impact of ambiguous loss is just generally just mixed and conflicting emotions. May experience a range of mixed conflicting emotions about this new person in your life. this person that you know, but the one in front of you is changed. They're different. And your ability and your desire to love and continue to care for him or her. Feelings of confusion, at times grateful and resentful. You feel betrayed and anger, guilty, hopeful, hopeless. It's confusing because you're grieving who they were, but you can also be grateful that they're still here. And with ambiguous loss, your destiny can seem very clouded, where it's hard to see past the next few minutes and the hours and days. We're going to go into The Stages of Grief by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her grief cycle. There is the survivor's experience of grief as well as those who love him or her that we'll talk about. And one of my favorite quotes that I feel like really paints a picture of this experience is, one of the hardest things to do is to grieve the loss of a person who is still alive. You truly experience a death, and then you have to work to create and adopt a new identity in living in the after. The first stage of grief is denial. It buffers the shock of loss, and it carries us through that first wave of pain. It often is described as feeling like a bad dream or a nightmare, and I just want to wake up from, where nothing makes sense. It helps us pace our feelings of grief, and it's nature's way of letting in only as much as we can handle. Anger. It may feel never ending. It may feel more intense than you've ever felt before. Blame is often misplaced and directed at the survivor, yourself, family, friends, doctors, God, or a higher power, and often people go through a loss of faith. Anger can often be an anchor, and it gives you temporary structure to the nothingness of loss. It doesn't have to make logical sense. Anger just is, and something that you're going to feel. At first, it can feel like grief could feel like you're being lost at sea. You're not connected to anything. Then you get angry at someone who didn't show up in the ICU, a person who is different now, a person who isn't around, and suddenly you have structure. Your anger is providing that structure. Another stage of grief is bargaining. It's often referred to as guilt's companion. And this is the stage where people ask, what if and if only? If we remain in the past, then we try to negotiate our way out of the hurt. It can give us temporary escape from our pain, and it provides hope. It gives a person time to adjust to the reality of the situation. In this stage, you're willing to do anything to get life back to the way it was before the injury, to rewind time, to do things different, to prevent the accident, to negotiate with God. You make endless promises to do better and to be better. Another stage of grief is depression. In this stage, you may feel deep sadness, emptiness, hopeless, helpless, very alone, and apathetic, feeling no interest and enthusiasm in the things that once brought you joy. This feeling of depression occurs as you become more and more aware of your circumstances, and it's not a sign of pathology or mental illness. This kind of depression is completely expected and appropriate, and given the loss and trauma that you've experienced. Acceptance. This stage does not mean everything is okay, and it's not an endpoint. It does not require forgetting, and it's okay to hate the brain injury. It's accepting the changes and recognizing that this is your new reality, where you begin to readjust and readapt and shift things, and you begin to live again. Many people naturally try to resist and attempt to go on living like they did before the injury. And as you experience glimpses of acceptance, you will realize that things are different now, and you can't live exactly as you did before. And it's much easier said than done. I want to say this about this whole presentation, that it's much easier said than done, because it's hard to turn the page when you know someone's not going to be in the next chapter of your life. So now what? You know about ambiguous loss. We know the stages of grief. What now? What do I do now that I know what's going on? What can I do? There are 6 guidelines for ambiguous loss, and they were developed by Pauline Voss, who I mentioned earlier, who coined the term ambiguous loss, and they're not meant to be gone through in a linear fashion. The goal is not to regain your independence necessarily, but rather to stay resilient and healthy in a relationship that is now less than perfect, with a loved one physically present, but psychologically cognitively, emotionally absent. And the goal is not closure. There's no such thing. There's no closure or certainty with ambiguous loss. Specialized therapy and support can be very helpful in navigating ambiguous loss. One of the things that I've done in my role as a neuro resource facilitator is help connect some of my clients to professionals and therapists that are brain injury sensitive and that understand ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss needs to be addressed with patience, care, and compassion. It's very unique. And these guidelines that I'm going to go through are not meant to be gone through in a linear fashion. Just as ambiguous loss lacks pattern, so does our grief. So the first guideline is finding meaning. So making sense of the situation. What helps? The first thing is giving the problem a name. As I said, that you may have experienced this phenomenon and now you know it has a name. Once you know it has a name, you can begin the process of understanding and finding meaning in it, which is tremendously validating and a sense of relief. You realize it's not an experience unique to only you. You are not alone in this situation. You're not the first person to walk through ambiguous loss. I've had many clients just a couple days ago, actually, that cry or weep upon hearing that ambiguous loss, that their experience has a name. It's an incredibly powerful, moving moment when they realize, I'm not crazy. This situation that I'm trying to navigate, these feelings that I'm having, I'm not crazy. There's a name for it. It's about finding sense in a senseless situation. Like I said earlier, you're not crazy. This situation is ambiguous loss makes you feel that way. And finding meaning does not mean avoiding suffering. You will still suffer and walk through the grief. One of the things that's suggested in this stage is continuing but adapting family rituals and celebrations to fit circumstances. One of the examples that I heard in a presentation was that rituals can help you find meaning in loss. A grown son went missing, and I don't know the circumstances, but to cope, his mother hung his coat by the front door, and their family received, for some reason, a monthly stipend. So to cope, she would put that monthly stipend in his coat pocket, and she would take out money every month to help pay for bills for her ailing husband, his father. And in that way, she felt like the son was helping and present in some way, even though he wasn't. And these rituals and celebrations that you adopt don't have to make sense to the people around you. For that particular person, that's what she needed. And there's something called both and thinking that's really important that we'll talk about. So both and thinking. It's the absence and presence, the idea that absence and presence are not absolutes. So it's learning to hold and live with two opposing truths in one's mind at the same time. You can hold on and you can let go. Both and thinking is often referred to as paradoxical thinking. So in the absence of answers and understanding, you can hold on and let go. You can be thankful and you cannot be. You can honor that space, the space between both and. It's something that you decide to accept, this kind of thinking versus surrendering to it. It provides the resiliency to move forward, even when ambiguity persists. And strength emerges not from one truth, but from holding on to an array of truths and possibilities. So for example, things like, I am both grateful to be his husband and devastated that I am now his caretaker. I take care of both him and myself. I am both a caregiver and a person with my own needs. I am both sad about my lost hopes and dreams and happy about some new plans ahead. And sometimes I am both thankful that he is still alive and sometimes wish that he hadn't survived. Just an example from my own life, when I was helping be a caregiver for my grandpa, I initially started out with the unhealthy thinking that if I'm a loving, committed granddaughter, then I have to stay for hours if I need to talk grandpa out of his hallucinations and delusions, resulting in panic attacks. Once I adopted that both and thinking, and I actually didn't realize that until I started putting this presentation together, things really changed. So I am both a loving, committed granddaughter, and I'm allowed to set limits and leave and go home. if grandpa is hallucinating and delusional and disoriented. This kind of thinking can be very powerful. The second guideline is adjusting mastery. So increasing one's ability to live with the ambiguity and decreasing your need for fixing or solving the problem. What helps? Knowing that and these, again, I don't say these lightly, these are not easy. Knowing that the world is not always fair, decreasing self-blame, externalizing blame, and mastering one's internal self. In our culture, our Western culture, we're very mastery-oriented. We strive to control everything in our lives to the best of our ability. And ambiguous loss takes this out of our hands completely. Conversely, in countries like China, for example, mourners regularly speak to their dead ancestors. And one study demonstrated that the bereaved there recovered more quickly from loss than bereaved Americans do. The more mastery-oriented we are, the harder time we have with a problem that has no solution, and ambiguous loss doesn't. And coincidentally, this morning on Facebook, I saw a post about in Provincetown, Cape Cod in Massachusetts, there is a new way that they've developed of connecting with lost loved ones. And I literally just heard about it a few hours ago, and it's called Phone of the Wind. And it was started in Japan. And it's a phone booth that they made and they put in Cape Cod, I think out in someone's lawn for anybody to use. And it's made completely out of wood with large see-through windows. And the large see-through windows was deliberate. The creators wanted people to not feel like they have to hide their grief or go through it alone and suffer silently. They believe that a collective community experience and a new way that they can share their losses with each other. They believe it makes grieving more concrete. And some actually used it for ambiguous loss that many of you are experiencing. So again, these rituals that we adopt don't have to make sense. But if they make sense to you and they're healing and helpful, that's enough. Our American ethic, our response to grief and mourning is, muscling through and suppress your feelings, avoid your feelings, stay busy, distract. And we end up, unfortunately, fooling ourselves into thinking that we're healing by being productive. While you can't control the loss that you're experiencing, somebody who's still here but not, you can control your reaction to it. And in this stage, they recommend things like practicing mindfulness, meditation, exercise, yoga, prayer, deep breathing, guided relaxation, a lot of mindfulness activities, a lot of self-care. The third strategy is reconstructing identity, or seeing yourself in a new way now that someone is missing. Because remember how I explained that ambiguous loss is, it's a rupturing of relationships, and it changes that person, it changes you, and it changes how you were in relation to each other. So what helps? Finding supportive family members or a psychological family. So following a confusing and massive loss like ambiguous loss, our identities are shaken. You have to establish who you are independent of this person, which is so very hard to do. And it's so hard to do when you're so intertwined. There's something called the prioritization of grief. An author, O'Rourke, says that there is an unspoken rule that mourning is something we do in the privacy of our inner lives alone, and it does not have to be. Our society tells us that it's not appropriate to be vulnerable in front of other people, so we hold each other at a distance. My mom coined a term, framily, so friends that feel like family. And in this stage, that's what this is all about, is whoever that is, whether it's blood family, friends, family, establishing a group that feels like family, that loves and supports you. And this is where community care comes in versus self-care. They're both important, but especially with ambiguous loss, the idea of community care is crucial. And it addresses the facts that humans are naturally cooperative. We require validation from each other to psychologically persevere and be resilient. We're doing this together. One thing that we tried to do with our person served here at the Brain Injury Alliance is to creatively grow someone's community, their support system, their natural supports. It's so crucial, wherever that comes from, whether it's a work, your colleagues, your church family, your neighbors. This is what this stage is all about. Normalizing ambivalence. So it's tolerating the tension of mixed emotions. What helps? Being aware that you're going to have conflicting feelings, and a lot of those are going to be pretty strong and completely opposite of each other. Like the example that I use is I feel so blessed that my husband is still here, yet at the same time, sometimes I wish he hadn't survived. Sometimes you're going to have some pretty intense conflicting feelings, and just being aware of the fact that that exists in ambiguous grief is important. The acceptance of an emotional roller coaster, that's also a part of grief. Normalizing your feelings and developing coping strategies. So recognizing that it's both normal and human to feel your feelings, observing and dealing with them as they come, feeling and acknowledging them. And they're not right or wrong, despite what the people around you might say. They just are. They're not right or wrong. And extend yourself some grace to feel and experience them. Because you're doing your best, your pain is important, and it doesn't feel like it, but you're healing at exactly the right pace. Another strategy for dealing with ambiguous loss is revising attachment. And this is really, really difficult. It's letting go while also holding on to someone that you love. So what helps? Recognizing that your loved one is both here and gone. So grieving what you have lost while acknowledging and celebrating what you still have. And finding new human connections, sharing and connecting with others. It's possible to let go of the past while still treasuring it. You can miss what was lost while also being grateful for what you still have. It does not have to be one or the other, although it can feel like it should be. And then another part of this stage that I read is practicing presence when you're with your loved ones. My grandpa actually taught me the value of being truly present with another human soul. Growing up, anytime we would visit, he would always call me Courtney D. He called all of us by our first and middle names. And he would say, Courtney D, tell me. And I remember even being in kindergarten, he would ask me about my day and what was going on with my life. And in those moments, he was completely present more than any other human that I've met, where nothing else mattered. He was not distracted. He was truly present. And so when I spent time with him in the skilled nursing facility, I learned to treasure his moments of lucidity, and I loved him through his delusions. And at one point, close to the time where he passed away from his second stroke, he randomly said to me one night, Courtney D, thank you for being present. And I remember feeling, wow, it's come full circle, this gift of presence. And it's so important, even outside of ambiguous grief, that we do this with other people. But as you're hopefully hearing through this presentation, there are certain themes, and one is that community, the sense of community, and being loved and supported by other people, being present with the people that you love. So that's a big part of this stage. The last one is discovering new hope. And this can feel very, very wrong, very foreign. This can be a very tough one also for many people. And again, I don't say these lightly as though they're easy to do. It's imagining a new way of being with or without the missing person. And what helps in this stage? Imagining your options, how scary and guilt-provoking that can be. It's important in this stage. You can find something you can control or master to balance out the absurdity and the ambiguity in your life, and recreate rituals. So redefining and reshaping the loss into something beneficial, helping others in similar situations, or simply just thinking of new ways of establishing hope. As I said earlier, you can hold two opposing truths at the same time. New hope can exist alongside old hope. You don't have to give up the old hope that, your husband will learn to walk again, or your child will come out of their coma. You can hold two opposing truths at the same time. Things like, I'm finally going to take some time for me, some me time. If you're a 24-hour, if you're a caregiver, you don't get much of that, if ever. So it could be something as simple as, I'm going to go to a support group for the first time, or I'm going to join the church choir. Even if you can't do it now, hopes and plans like these are necessary. If you give yourself something, anything, big or small, regardless of what anybody thinks about it, their judgments, you need something positive, something to look forward to. You can give yourself permission to hope, but also add something new and fresh and hopeful that you can look forward to in the future. And that's it. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And I think I've ended a little bit early, so if there are comments, if there are questions, we certainly have some time. And before we jump into that, I just want to thank you all again, because truly this is a topic that really is professionally and personally very dear to me. And I've been wanting to present on this for some time. So I do hope that whether you're a survivor, a caregiver, a professional, that you walk away with information and tools. And if anything, if you've experienced this and not known that it has a name, that you walk away with validation and a sense of relief that you're not alone, and that you now know what ambiguous loss is.
Thank you, Courtney. I've opened up my chat to see if anybody is on and has any questions. I'm going to give folks just a moment to enter their questions if you have anything. And while you're doing that, I just want to inform everyone of some events that we have coming up of our own. We have a lot coming up. So we have our Family and Caregiver Workshop on March 4th. Where Courtney will actually also be presenting on this topic as well, and we'll have more time one-on-one with folks too. We'll also have our brain injury fundamentals training on March 4th, which is more for direct service professionals, and then our 28th annual Best Practices in Brain Injury Services Conference is March 5th and 6th, and all of these events will be held at the Sheraton Hotel in West Des Moines. So if you're interested in those events, they're all up on our website, and you can register for those. The Family and Caregiver Workshop is free, so if you live in the area, or if it's something that would be a good time for you, it's around we'll be starting at 12 and hopefully ending around 4 for that workshop. So we would love to have everyone attend and let people know that that it's happening. So please help us spread the word on that. So I do have one question that has come in about are these presentation slides available? And I'll leave that up to you, Courtney.
Oh yeah, no, I'm fine with that.
Okay.
I don't know, Annie, unless you have a suggestion about the best way to make it available, but absolutely. And I also want to say too, I have been an attendee to many webinars myself, and I often leave with questions or comments that I don't necessarily want to share at the end. So please feel free to, my contact information should still be up on the screen. You can contact me or just the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa in general if you have any questions or needs, because I understand if you don't want to bring them up, especially with such a weighty topic. So I just wanted to put that out there as well.
Yeah, I think that we could save them into PDF and then send them out through email along with everyone's certificate of attendance. So I'll make sure to do that.
Okay.
We do have a couple of other questions for you, Courtney. One is from Mary Swartz. Does ambiguous loss apply to the issue of a child born with a disability? Can you speak to that? And then also, parents didn't know this child before, but had lots of hopes and dreams that may not come to pass. So can you speak to that? Kids who are born.
Yeah, the child born with a disability, that would be that ambiguous loss. That would fit into that ambiguous loss type 2, where somebody is present, but even if from birth they are, they've got disabilities or they're cognitively quote different, you're still going to start out as a parent grieving the life and the dreams that you had for yourself and for that child potentially. So that would fit into that type 2, where someone's here, but things are different and they're not maybe how you expected them to be. So yes, that would be a perfect example of type 2 ambiguous loss.
Thanks, Courtney. And then Kava Nags is wondering if the presentation will be available so that she can share. And just a reminder, yes, it is recorded, and we will have it up on our YouTube page, and we'll link it to our Facebook and our website all within the coming days. So hopefully by early next week, we will have this as a version that you can share and listen to again. And yeah. Bridget Rudin chatted in. She said, as a survivor, regarding the things said, did this only apply to just the advocate? She feels connected with many
Hmm.
of the things. Could you be able to speak?
Yes, absolutely. So this particular presentation is about caregiving and life after and life with ambiguous loss. But yes, this is equally um, as for the survivor as it is for a caregiver, because you yourself in living as a survivor are going to grieve who you were before, pre-injury, versus who you are now, and rediscovering what can I still do, what can I relearn, who am I now if I can't walk, who am I now if I can't work at the same job, who am I now if my spouse leaves me because I have an injury. Yes, this very much applies just as equally to a survivor as it does to the people around a survivor. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Courtney. Yeah, I would just kind of piggyback on that and say, folks who are impacted by brain injury um, feel a range of emotions and a variety of different things. And I would say that in all forms, probably experience some sort of ambiguous loss after a brain injury, whether it's on them or a loved one or a friend or a family member. Yeah, I would just agree with that.
Absolutely.
Those are all the questions that we have right now. And like Courtney said, if you have any other questions you want to chat with her later, you can email her at that email she has listed there, csand@biaia.org. I just want to thank everybody for being on today. This was recorded. It will be on our YouTube page, so please check that out if you'd like to share that. We will send your certificate of attendance through email right after this session. But thank you, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.